So next up is Carrie Brown. Dr. Carrie Brown is the Director of Resource Refocus, who specializes in decarbonization and resiliency from the lens of policy research, program design, evaluation, codes and standards, and other technical consulting. She is active in ASHRAE and International Building Performance Simulation Association. She is actually the World Secretary and immediate past president of the International Building Performance. She plays a major role in the Task Force for Decarbonization as part of their executive committee, and she is chair of TC 4.2 Climatic Information. All climate data that comes into ASHRAE handbooks or guides is from this technical committee which Carrie chairs. She holds a PhD in building technology from MIT, an MS from Berkeley, and a BS from MIT. So how much more can you do? Please welcome Carrie Brown.
Great, thank you, Scott. All right, today I'm going to give you updates on two different topics. I will start by telling you about some of the work the ASHRAE Task Force for Building Decarbonization has been doing over the past few years. And then I'll give you an introduction to a recently completed report by NYC, the New York State Climate Impact Assessment. So starting with the Task Force for Building Decarbonization, about 2 years ago, ASHRAE released a position document on building decarbonization. And the overarching point of this is that ASHRAE believes that we need to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment to address climate change. Within the position document, there are two main goals. The first is that by 2030, the global built environment must have its 2015 global GHG emissions. This means that all new buildings must be net zero energy, widespread energy efficiency retrofits, and new construction embodied carbon should be reduced at least 40%. By 2050, we have a very aggressive goal that all new and existing assets must be net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the entire building life cycle. In addition to the position document, the Task Force for Building Decarbonization has a few other main categories. They've been developing technical tools, they've been coordinating with standards, and then also really focusing on education efforts. So starting on the technical tools, as Ginger said, there's 7 technical guides that are being developed over the course of a few years. Right now on the website, you can download the building performance standards and the grid interaction buildings for decarbonization. And then over the next few months, you'll have 5 more guides that are available. Decarbonizing hospital buildings and a guide for applying heat pumps should be available soon, and then the others should be available this society year. On the education side, Ginger also mentioned there's quite a few courses that are under development or already developed. So right now, you can take an ALI course on Introduction to Building Decarbonization. There's also Fundamentals of Decarbonization Design Systems and Equipment Applications. And then there will be others that will be available over the next year or so, looking at whole life decarbonization and advanced designs for net zero energy and low carbon buildings. In addition to releasing all of the guides, we'll be developing training to go along with those. So you can both read the guide, but you can also take the course to understand the guide in more depth. Right now, we're developing the training course for the grid interactive buildings and the decarbonizing hospital buildings. There's a team already underway working on that, so we'll have those ready soon. There's also a team working on the whole life decarbonization strategies. In parallel to this, the task force has been working really hard to coordinate across all of the standards. So early on in the process, we took a look at all of the ASHRAE standards that are touching emissions in some form and really tried to get these all to be coordinating with one another. So this is touching new construction, existing buildings, as well as the whole life carbon and other specialty topics. For new construction, standard 90.1 for commercial buildings, this already has carbon as a metric in Appendix I. and it has a jurisdictional option for zero energy code adoption in progress. Standard 90.2 on the residential side, it published an addendum F to incorporate carbon rating index. It's also developing a jurisdictional option, and their target is to publish late this year. Standard 90.4 for data centers has the addition of operational carbon metrics intended for the 2015 version, and they're also aligning with the 50% reduction goal by 2030. Standard 189, the 2023 edition, has a performance path for a carbon metric, also a jurisdictional option, and new requirements for demand response. And then 189.3 has an electrification option. On the existing buildings, Standard 100 is the first ANSI standard on building performance, and this was a very aggressively tracked standard development. The major changes incorporated greenhouse gas emissions per performance requirements. It updated the energy targets, and it added guidance on developing performance targets with local officials. Also on the existing buildings, Standard 211 for the commercial building energy audits. They put out a call for membership last fall. They finalized this in Chicago, and now they're working on a work plan to address decarbonization audits. Standard 240P is one that's focusing on evaluating greenhouse gas emissions in building design, construction, operation, and embodied carbon. And then in parallel, there's 242P, which will be looking at a detailed calculation for carbon metrics. And the idea is that with all of these standards that are addressing the emissions, we'll be able to look at one standard with a standardized methodology. The Task Force for Building Decarbonization has been working for several years, and the overarching goal was to figure out how to incorporate building decarbonization into the ASHRAE structure. And I'm happy to say that as of January at the Chicago meeting, the board officially voted to approve the Center of Excellence for Building Decarbonization. This will be a permanent fixture in ASHRAE moving forward. And so the task force is right now working on the transition, and in Indianapolis, we'll have an update for all of you on the center. And the main goals of the center is going to be strategy, so providing strategic direction for ASHRAE. It'll be updated annually to make sure that we're staying up to date. And also thought leadership, so monitoring what are these future issues, how can we address them, how can we publicize ASHRAE's both positions and educational resources. Collaboration within the industry is going to be critical, so we'll continue working with groups like MEP 2040, working on the global policy, and also working on public advocacy, so really working closely with government affairs to make sure that all of this information is translated for multiple audiences. Supporting activities, so many of you may have been involved in helping with the guides. We had well over 100 volunteers. Moving forward, we'll have a similar structure. There'll be decarbonization task groups. If any of you have worked on an ASHRAE multidisciplinary task group, it'll be a similar formation. But these will be specialty topics that we'll be asking for volunteers. Hopefully, all of you will say yes to that. And sort of doing quick moving projects. And I just want to emphasize this is a journey. This is a long-term thing that we're embarking on. We hope that you will volunteer your time and help us. If you'd like to know more about the Task Force for Building Decarbonization and the Center for Excellence in Building Decarbonization, you can go to the ASHRAE website to learn more about that. So now I'm going to switch over to the other topic. This is a study that was completed by NYC. It was just released earlier this year, and it's the New York State Climate Impact Assessment. So what is an assessment? If you haven't read a climate impact assessment, this is a peer-reviewed scientific investigation into how climate change is affecting New York State communities, ecosystems, infrastructure, and industries. It includes up-to-date projections of the future climate conditions of New York State, in-depth economic impact analysis, as well as accompanying communication materials. So if you download the assessment right now, I think all of the chapters is about over 1,000 pages, but there's also little fact sheets and things like that that you can share with other groups. The overall goal of the assessment is first to document how the changing climate is affecting New York State, to help foster informed decisions, and then present the data and information to help New Yorkers understand, plan, and act. There are 8 different sectors that are covered in this climate impact assessment. I'll be talking about the building chapter that I was involved in. And for each of these 8 different sectors, there were technical working group co-chairs that led a technical working group, and then they had sector advisors who would come in sort of on a quarterly basis. And then they also had external expert reviewers. All said, there were well over 200 people who worked on this climate impact assessment. For the buildings chapter, I co-chaired this with Dr. Nick Rajkovic, and we had a great group of technical work group members. And I think something that was interesting about this assessment is there was a very specific goal to have a varied set of inputs. So it was a mix of academics, practitioners, policy folks, just trying to make sure that we had a lot of different views going into this. Can you trust it? I think we challenged Zotero to the max. It's extensively cited, so you can see where all the data is coming from. It's peer-reviewed by topic experts, and you can go in and see where all of the information is coming from for full transparency. Results. For the building chapter section, it'll start with a general introduction to the scope and context. It'll then talk about equity and climate justice issues. We'll go through the observed and projected climate impacts, as well as to talk about vulnerable populations and systems. And then it closes with recommendations on adaptation and resilience strategies, and includes case studies and traceable accounts as well. Major impacts for the building sector. The first is increasing temperatures. So I think it's not surprising to hear that annual average temperatures are projected to continue to rise due to climate change. And there's a special concern of the multi-day extreme heat waves. When this is coupled with urban heat island, there's a major concern for buildings in New York, especially in the urban environment. Changes in precipitation. So we are expecting to see increase in the frequency, intensity, and amount of heavy precipitation. And particularly with heavy rainstorms, there's a major concern with flood damage. This could be affecting the structure of buildings. It could be bringing debris into the buildings, causing secondary things like breaking windows. So there's a major flooding concern. And then in partnership with that sea level rise, they are expecting the state's coastline to rise by about 2 to 3 feet by the end of the century. And again, seeing an increase in the frequency and extent of the storm surge and coastal flooding. So some of the things that we'll need to be thinking about are updated floodplain analyses when you're designing new buildings or retrofitting existing ones, starting to think about getting your equipment out of the ground floor and up higher in the building, and really thinking through some backup options within your building. Extreme events such as hurricanes, tropical storms, and nor'easters. The New York State is expecting to experience increased hazards from these extreme events, and this includes, in addition to the precipitation, extreme temperatures, also high winds and inland flooding as well. One of the major focuses of the climate impact assessment was really looking at vulnerability and equity concerns. People of color, indigenous people, and low-income individuals are more likely to live in communities with buildings that have greater exposure to the climate hazards. These are often called frontline communities, and within these communities, we're most concerned about people who are over 65, children, and the chronically ill. Frontline communities often are in the hottest parts of the city. They're often in buildings that have a historical lack of investment, and they are often groups of people who don't have the ability to relocate. They can't just move somewhere else for a year while their building is being retrofit. So this is really a challenging area to address. Key finding number 1, buildings of all ages, functions, and locations across New York State are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Said another way, if you're in a building in New York State, you will be affected. So what should we be doing now? Property owners of both existing and new construction can start by identifying which risks are most prevalent for their location and starting to think about implementing climate resilience strategies to address both the current and the future risks. Key finding 2, given the long lifespan of buildings, new construction and retrofits that consider long-term climate projections will better address the future risk. And so I think this is something really important in the assessment, is that we need to start thinking of the sort of prioritization over time. It's not a one solution for your entire building because the component parts of your building have different lifespans. So one solution for your HVAC system that has a 15 to 20-year lifespan will be different from the one for your envelope, which can be much, much longer for generations to come. And so on the equipment side, we do have the opportunity to retrofit and have adaptation, but on the envelope side, it's much harder to do that later. So we really need to focus on that now to make sure we get it right as early as we can. Key finding 3, climate impacts to buildings can ripple to many parts of the community. Buildings are interconnected with the rest of the community. You know, they touch all of the other sectors that I talked about earlier in this. And this is especially important for some of the critical facilities like schools, community centers, hospitals. It's really important to make sure that we have backup plans, sustainable passive solutions for these buildings so they can continue to operate during extreme events. Key finding 4, communities of color, tribal communities, and low-income communities are more likely to congregate, live, and work in buildings that have greater exposure to climate hazards. As I said before, the homes and other buildings for underserved communities are more susceptible to the impacts of climate change. They're in the hottest parts of the city. They really need investment in these buildings. So what can we do? We can improve the quality and standards of buildings, both for new construction and really focusing on retrofits. Key finding 5, individual adaptation and resilience strategies can address multiple climate impacts. So as we're starting to think of these solutions, we really want to think about holistic options. You know, for example, putting on photovoltaics and backup batteries are both helping with the mitigating climate change, but it's also helping us to be ready for a power outage or things like that. The counterpoint to that is if we're not thinking about holistic strategies, if you're just focusing on energy efficiency, we can be in a situation where we're putting in maladaptive strategies. For example, if you have a building with a curtain wall and a really efficient HVAC system, it might look okay from a standards perspective, but if you get an outage in the summer with several days without power, you're going to have major performance situations for the buildings inside. So what are some opportunities for positive change? Regenerative design is something that is starting to be more and more common. And the point of this is that we're not just thinking about how to avoid the bad impacts of climate change. We're really thinking about creating spaces that reconnect occupants with nature while also improving the condition of the surrounding environment. So we're not just trying to do less bad, we're actually trying to do good. Strategies with co-benefits of greenhouse gas emission reduction and climate adaptation, like I said, the example of renewables and battery. Another great example is green roofs, because we are helping the performance of the buildings, but at the same time, you're helping with urban heat island reductions, and you can also help with some of the flooding mitigation. Some of the advancements in the industry, building performance simulation, a pet project of mine always. There's really advanced building management systems, starting to look at smart microgrids. So if you would like to know more about this, you can go to just search for the New York State Climate Impact Assessment. You can download each of the 8 chapters as well as fact sheets for all of these. And over the next few months, this will continue to be updated with more case studies and other versions of the information to get to different target audiences. Are we doing questions, Scott? Are we? Okay, take a few questions on either of the topics.
So just to adhere to the PDH process, we need to ask the audience a couple questions. If you know the answer, please raise your hand. The first question for Carrie is and I saw her say it, according to ASHRAE's Building Decarbonization Position Document, by 2050 at the latest, all new and existing assets must be net zero GHG emissions across the whole life cycle. Is that true or false? True. Yes, right? Yes, I heard her say it. Second question, climate change is affecting New York State now and is projected to continue to change and affect every region of the state. Even under a low emission scenario, climate change impacts across New York State will be substantial. Every community and every sector in New York State has the potential to contribute to innovative climate solutions that reduce vulnerabilities, foster resilience, and enhance equity. And that's a real softball. Is that a false or true statement? True. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Carrie.